This is the story of Japan Airlines Flight 123, one of the deadliest crashes in aviation history. The jumbo jet had just taken off from Tokyo's Haneda Airport, bound for Osaka, when the unthinkable happened. Moments after takeoff, the jumbo jet started to break up in midair. It was August 1985, and what followed was an absolute nightmare scenario. All 520 passengers and 12 crew members on board lost their lives. But what went wrong? Let's find out. On that fateful day, Boeing 747SR was scheduled to fly from Tokyo's Haneda Airport to Osaka International Airport. The plane, known as the 747SR, was an earlier version of the larger 747. The aircraft was well maintained, and it was undergoing no major repairs. At the time of the crash, the pilot in command was 61-year-old Tatsudo Horii. He had been with Japan Airlines for over 30 years, racking up a total of 31,800 hours of flight time. On that day, he was the most experienced pilot flying. The other two pilots were fully qualified and had plenty of experience under their belts. The three pilots met with the aircraft's 9 cabin crew members 40 minutes prior to departure. They discussed several things during the meeting, including weather conditions and the possibility of turbulence. The crew decided to take off in relatively low visibility, since they would be landing at their destination in similar conditions. They checked the weather forecast for Osaka and found that there were thunderstorms and thick fog in the area. The pilots decided to set their final destination as runway 26, which had better weather than the other runways. This meant that if visibility was bad at the airport, they could divert to another runway. The pilots also took into account the possibility of winds here and turbulence during takeoff and landing due to the terrain near the airport. At 11:52 a.m. local time, the 747SR took off from Haneda Airport. As the massive plane climbed into the cloudy sky, the pilots engaged the autopilot system and set the altitude to 29,000 feet. Then they put the jumbo jet into a left bank to track 270 degrees, just 6 minutes after takeoff, while the plane was climbing through 25,000 feet. The pilots noticed that the outside air temperature was higher than expected. The captain said, "It's warm today," to which the first officer replied, "Sure is." At 11:58 a.m., the pilots contacted Tokyo Air Route Control Center and informed them that they would like to climb to 31,000 feet. As the plane continued to climb, its left engine slowed down. The pilots did not seem to be concerned about this, however, and they continued with their conversation. At 11:59 a.m., the captain asked the cabin crew to prepare for turbulence. He then turned the seatbelt sign on and told the passengers to fasten their seatbelts. Within seconds, the 747 hit some serious turbulence. The jumbo jet dropped from 31,000 feet to 27,000 feet in less than a minute. The pilots fought hard to regain control of the plane. They pulled back power on the left side and increased thrust on the right. Despite their efforts, the plane kept dropping. They radioed to the control tower that they had lost the use of their left engine. The captain said, "We've got a problem here. We're losing speed and we're going down." He then added, "Mayday, mayday." The captain knew that they might need to turn around and head back to the airport. He said, "How's our fuel?" To which the second officer replied, "We've got enough fuel, sir." The captain then responded, "All right, let's go home." At this point, they had plenty of fuel to make it back to the airport. As the pilots struggled to keep the plane stable, they received a signal from the control tower instructing them to head to an airport. But before they could respond, the 747 broke apart in midair. The massive plane fragmented into 3 pieces and rained down onto the mountains of Ogesi. One piece landed in the village of Mino, another fell near Mount Takamagara, and the third piece landed close to Mount Omini. In the aftermath of the crash, investigators found that the plane had broken up as a result of the immense pressure placed on the rear of the plane. They found that the rear of the fuselage had cracked and split open due to the high pressure. This caused the plane to break up and eventually fall out of the sky. But what caused the pressure to rise so high? You're probably thinking that maybe the pilots had done something wrong, or that maybe the plane was in some kind of trouble. But you'd be wrong. In fact, the pilots had done everything right, and the plane itself was in perfect working order. So what really caused the crash? Well, it all came down to one tiny little detail. You see, several years prior to the crash, the plane had undergone some maintenance work. During this work, some parts of the plane were replaced with parts that were slightly different from the original parts. Now, these new parts weren't necessarily bad parts, but they were different, and this caused a big problem. You see, when the plane was tested, it wasn't tested as one complete unit. Instead, it was tested in sections, and this led to a miscalculation. The engineers didn't realize that the combination of all these different parts would cause such a big problem. In fact, they didn't even know that there was a problem until it was too late. To make matters worse, the original parts that were removed from the plane were sold to another company. So by the time investigators realized what had happened, it was already too late. They never should have messed with the plane in the first place. Investigators found that the new part that was installed on the plane was actually stronger than the original part. This meant that the plane was actually stronger than it was when it was originally built. But this also created a blind spot. Since the new part was stronger, it didn't break under pressure like the old part would have. This meant that the engineers didn't catch the problem during testing. They thought that the plane was safe to fly, but in reality, it was a ticking time bomb. But why did this cause the plane to explode in midair? Well, you see, when the plane hit some turbulence, it put a lot of pressure on the back of the plane. The back of the plane expanded and contracted rapidly, and this caused the stress to increase. Eventually, the stress became too much for the back of the plane to handle, and it ruptured. This caused the plane to break up and eventually fall out of the sky. So why didn't the pilots notice that something was wrong? Well, you see, the pilots didn't notice anything unusual. The plane was handling itself just fine. In fact, the only reason that they knew something was wrong was because they saw the engine failure warning. But by the time they realized that they had an engine problem, it was already too late. The plane was in too much of a dive, and there was nothing they could do to save it. But could they have done anything to prevent the crash? Well, maybe. You see, when the plane was in the shop, the workers should have tested the plane as one complete unit. If they had done that, they would have noticed the problem, but they didn't. And this led to one of the deadliest crashes in aviation history. But what makes this crash so remarkable is the fact that it could have been completely avoided. If the plane hadn't been tampered with, it wouldn't have broken up in midair. The pilots were doing everything right, and the plane was in perfect condition. But one small mistake led to one of the deadliest crashes in history. But what happened to the families of the victims? Well, the families of the victims were understandably devastated. They lost loved ones, and they had no idea why. The crash led to a huge investigation, and eventually, the truth came out. The families were angry, but there was nothing they could do. The crash was a terrible tragedy, but it also had a silver lining. The crash led to changes in the way that planes are designed and maintained, and this has saved countless lives. In the end, the crash was a terrible tragedy, but it also taught us some valuable lessons. We hope that you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you next time.